I started as an investor, similar to Bianca, many years ago, and then I went to work for the then CFO of AstraZeneca, a guy called Simon Lowth, and spent 5 years in industry before joining my current employers, WG, who are a London-based specialist healthcare investment bank. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of drugs for GPCRs and ion channels, and sort of what the opportunities are, and also a bit of history, because I agree with Bianca. History repeats itself because nobody's listening. So GPCR drugs have a strong pedigree. It's not a new class of drug. In fact, sort of 25 to 35% of all drugs, including 6 of the top 20 bestsellers of all time, have been against GPCR targets. One of the things that you'll notice here is that all of these drugs' peak year of sales came at about the same time, which kind of implies they were all discovered about the same time. So they kind of represent the low-hanging fruit of this sort of category. I remember when I started out having a meeting with JP Garnier, the then CEO of Glaxo, talking a bit about how he was going to boost productivity, and it was all about, I've bought these new ultra-high throughput screens, and I'm going to screen more compounds, and I'm going to do more stuff, and that's the way we're going to do it. And I think it's very important to remember where pharmaceutical companies come from historically. They came out of chemical companies, and so their historic skill set was about having massive libraries and doing things in an industrial way. And they weren't biology companies. They weren't really about, I understand the pathology of the disease and therefore this is a great target. They have become better at that over time, but there has been a sort of a tendency to have this kind of situation where you get the easy stuff first because of the way that you approach targeting things. So GPCR drugs continue to be important. These are bio-dollar numbers, but we're talking about vast sums of money, billions of dollars in partnering agreements over the last 10 years. I've noted on the slide 2012 looks a bit poor, but when I actually go back and look at the data, it just turns out that nobody was willing to say what the numbers were, so they count as 0 in that year. But I think pharma is continually out there looking for innovation, has become the historic sort of 20 years ago. I think a lot of companies had a not invented here mentality, and they would, if it wasn't their science, they didn't trust it, and their science was always better. Whereas I think we've moved to a more of a situation where pharma companies realise that they can't be experts on absolutely everything, and they want to partner with people and to get insight, and are willing to partner slightly earlier in order to gain more insights. I think also one of the interesting things that's happened, and I kind of saw this happen at Astra, when you have patent cliffs, you get big P&L pressure at pharmaceutical companies, and so R&D budgets get squeezed, and senior management are thinking very much about how they can get the next drugs to the market as quickly as possible. And so what they do with their R&D budgets is they go, right, we're spending it all on late stage development. So you end up with this shifting pattern of we're not spending as much in discovery and we're spending more, and we had this patent cliff sort of 2010, 2011, and the response of the industry to that was that they shifted a load of money into late stage development and didn't spend enough. Yeah. And so we've now reached a part of the cycle where they're paying for that. So they're out having to do partnering deals to get stuff to help bolster the pipeline, because they've got this gap that was a result of their spending choices 5 years ago. Ion channels, again, I don't have the numbers for how many drugs are ion, but ion channels, again, very common target, but also I think quite a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and again, it's been done by screening and serendipitously rather than by particularly understanding the role of these channels in the biology of disease. And I think that the two things that the classes have in common that are very interesting, Mick talked quite eloquently about the biased antagonism issue. historically, I think certainly investors, maybe less pharma companies, looked at these targets as it's on-off. You're an agonist or you're an antagonist. Ion channels and GPCRs, I think we're moving more to a space where people understand that modulating these pathways is important. It's not simply about switching them on and off. And also, we're very much moving into an era where people understand that there are multiple pathways, and I think we're going to see over the next 10 years that combination therapies are going to be much more important than they have been historically. The era of we've got one drug, it hits one target, and we're going to sell it to everyone through primary care physicians is probably coming to an end. Again, the ion channels, the deals have gone up and down. The value spikes up and down, also according to disclosure. But I think generally it tells you that there's been steady, if variable, interest in this category for partnering. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about why pharma companies do certain kinds of deals. Why would they in-license something when they could just acquire the company? What is it they're looking for when they in-license an asset? So I think talking about in-licensing, obviously what you're looking for first and foremost is it a good strategic fit? If I'm in anti-inflammatory, respiratory and oncology, am I going to buy a neuro asset? And the answer is probably not, because I won't know what I'm going to do with it, and I don't have a real way of assessing it. So it's got to fit. Does it also fit into my pipeline? Do I have a phase 3 asset and loads of stuff in preclinical development, but nothing that's going to enter phase 2 in the next 5 years? In which case I might go out and look for an asset in that field that is ready to go because it plugs a strategic gap in my portfolio. Is it a validated target? Is it something which I know lots of people are working on in this space and there's a lot of published data about? Or is it something really left field, which looks interesting, but because basically in-licensing as a strategy is all about risk mitigation for big pharma. They're effectively paying a little bit up front and they're getting an option, and they're willing to pay more to do that. And you have to think about the human element. If you're a guy in a big pharma company and you really bang the drum and you say, we need to buy this company, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and then a year later it falls over, that's your career. Whereas if you do an in-licensing deal, you're much less risky, which brings us to the acquisitions and the second to last point. If the CEO says, yeah, let's go and buy this, then it happens because the risk mitigation is gone, because your boss's boss has said, let's do this. So, and it can be as simple as that.
It's my fault.
Yeah, it ain't my fault. He said we could do it,
I'm leaving in 5 years anyway.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So what do you need to get the pharma to do the in-licensing deal? Well, you need some proof of concept, you need strong IP, you need a good preclinical package. There's a lot of times when you have companies who put stuff together and they do a deal and yet the drug doesn't seem to move anywhere with the new company. It's because that company's said, we liked it, but we actually didn't like the package you gave us. You did the wrong tox. We need to go back and look at this before we'll advance it. And therefore they get a smaller upfront than they would have done otherwise. So you have to have the right things, and you have to be able to make the thing. It's no use going, I've got this fantastic data, but we can't validate the manufacturing, and it's got a gross margin of 30%. Nobody's going to buy that. So on the acquisition side of things, why do companies I'm going to come on to Ablinks later as a case study, but why do people buy whole companies? One of the things is unencumbered pipeline. So if there's a lot of assets in there that haven't been partnered yet and you can get them all in one go, that's something that a pharma company would be interested in. Is there a platform technology that's useful to you and also strategically valuable in the sense that I can take it out of my competitors' hands, they won't have access to it if I take it in-house? Have I got real confidence that the lead candidate is going to market? Because if I have, then effectively I'm avoiding paying the royalties that I'm going to have to pay. Usually what people do is they do the first one, and then when they've gone through phase 2 and they realise they've got to pay whopping big milestones and potentially royalties forever, then they take take the company out. What their particular risk appetite is, obviously, as I mentioned before, whether the CEO is something he wants to do, and whether they have a pre-existing partnership. Companies like to buy what they know. I mean, it's very hard to enter an auction process and do due diligence and be really confident about paying a large price for something when you've got to do that in a month. If you've worked for someone for a couple of years, you know what the asset is, you know what their capabilities are, you know what the wrinkles are, and therefore you feel a lot more confident. So doing partnerships sort of really effectively helps eventually getting bought out. So AdBlinks as a case study. I'd like to thank Sam for updating this, because I did these slides a week ago and then they were completely out of date. So I think AdBlinks is a 15-year overnight success story. It's the slides that Bianca showed, which is like nothing happens. Oh my goodness! And it took a lot of work for them to get to where they're done. So they started with a bit of 10 employees and a bit of seed funding, and it took them 5 years and 70 million of sort of VC funding to their 70 million euros of VC funding to get to their European IPO, by which stage they had 11 projects and one antibody in the clinic. So actually, I think AdAlta have done a remarkable job to get where they are with the amount of capital that they've got. By that stage, they had 144 employees. But it takes a lot of money to do this. Today, they basically had a lot of cash, and they'd got a lot of cash in from the partnerships that they'd done. And as the next slide shows, they had quite a lot of unencumbered pipeline, as I referred to before. So they had assets which were approaching the market, which would generate revenue. And they'd got a lot of partners. So a lot of people knew the technology and knew how it worked. I can't see down there if Genzyme's down there, which is owned by Sanofi, and that's one of the partners who are involved. So Sanofi, when they came along, so you can see Novo, who made the first bidder, down there. So they clearly knew the asset and understood the science, and they made the offer. And then I think Bianca's right. The Sanofi guys, who had a lot of projects with these guys and really understood the technology, were able to do their due diligence really quickly and say, no, we can't afford to let these assets go to someone else. But
was there a strong chance of that?
Well, Novo had made a hostile offer which they'd refused. So.
Novo, during that week, when Sanofi was putting the bid in, basically said, we're coming in with a new offer in 2 days. And I think that was then where, and you also have to look at it from a Sanofi perspective. Sanofi missed out on 2 deals, Actelion as well as innovation. So I don't think the CEO was really inclined to let something else go. So I think he really had to.
Yeah. So it helps if you've got someone bidding for you who's missed a couple, because you'll get a nice premium. So AdBlinks had done a number of GPCR deals. We saw some of them on the last slide. So they'd done one with BI and one with Novartis. And in a sense, it doesn't matter if those deals are successful and the product makes it to market. You get a little bit of money in, you get input from other scientists, you get to work together, people understand your technology. So the Novartis one might have failed, but I'm sure that was still quite a productive thing for the company.
It's still on board.
Is it? Okay. So they're still looking. Ion channel deals, the technology's been used to look at some interesting stuff for Merck. I won't drag you through all of it. Here's another interesting company that this is more about platform technologies within gene protein coupled receptors. So Heptares was a little UK company which got bought out for $180 million with a sort of $220 million earnout. They had 1 phase 1 product and 7 preclinical leads, but they had an interesting platform. So in some ways that's quite similar to to where AdAlta is at. So they got bought out by Sosai, a Japanese company. And again, there's an element of validation from partnership in this story. So the likes of Allergan and Teva and Astra had all looked at the technology. And so there were some partnering deals involved there. Things like the Teva deal, they're not huge upfronts, or they wouldn't make they don't make or break a company in terms of the cash flow coming into the company, but it's about validating the technology. It's about having other people understand it and use it. So again, the Astra deal, not a 10 million upfront is peanuts. I'd be surprised if we, when I was at Astra, if we even bothered to, I'd have to go back and look, if we even bothered to announce that. That might have been below the disclosure threshold, but it makes other people who are invested in Heptares say, well, actually, scientists who know what they're doing are interested in the technology and using it. So there may be some sort of legs to the story here. So I think just in conclusion, before we move to the panel, I think, as I mentioned earlier, pharma is hungrier than ever for innovative approaches. They've got pipelines that they need to restock because of their own shuffling of their R&D money in their P&Ls. Gene protein coupled receptors and ion channels are going to remain very important, and we're entering an era where, although the low-hanging fruit's gone, we start to understand their involvement in disease pathology better, and we also understand better how to modulate these targets. So I think we'll see better drugs as a result. Pharma companies basically acquire companies with validated platforms, so clinical data is very important. I think the amount of approaches that Sam will get for partnership will increase probably exponentially as soon as there's clinical data to show people. That's just my view, but and developing an unencumbered pipeline. You saw with Heptares, it was one asset in sort of phase 1, but 7 assets in preclinical development was enough to make somebody say, well, actually, this is a ready-made collection of assets that we might be looking at. So, but the key point is validating platforms and building pipelines takes time and money. And I think Bianca's slides illustrated that fantastically. We'd all like to be able to look at charts like that and say, oh, I'm going to invest here, and it goes up tomorrow, because your returns look fantastic if you can manage that. But it's actually a mug's game. It's much more about funding a decent team and a platform that can drive value into the future, and being prepared to wait for somebody larger to recognise that. So that's make sure we move on to the panel, so they can all contradict me.
Anthony, Anthony, just a quick question. So you're saying that there'll be expect a lot more early stage deals, like phase 1 type deals, or
I think it varies. I think there's the potential for that, because but companies generally like to avoid risk. So you'll do a phase 1 deal. This is my view, and the panel are more expert than me. You might do a phase 1 deal even without the sort of phase 2 proof of concept data, if you're very confident about what the target is and you really understand the target. So if you know you've got target engagement and good clean tox and all that sort of stuff, you might do. You might not necessarily pay a huge amount of money. I mean, in the fibrosis space, a lot of the deals have been done at the end of phase 1, and partly that's because it's a hot space and people are aggressive, but partly it's because people are focused on NASH, and you have to be a big company to do a NASH trial because it takes 2 years and it's going to cost you $200 million. I think it'd be quite nice if you guys could hold your asset to the end of phase 2, because I think an IPF study is a quicker readout, cleaner, and I think but if somebody offers you have to be sensible, don't you? If somebody offers you big money up front, you take it.
So, Anthony, what do you think about, on the one side of things, you've got a small company that would like to do partnering deals to bring in non-dilutive capital and help validate the platform, because deals help validate the platform and build relationships, versus the small company going it alone, retaining the asset, and retaining significant upside for acquisition down the road?
Yeah, I think and it's the balance between an unencumbered pipeline and partnering. And I think if you're capable of structuring things so that you're doing partnering deals, and they're almost the other guy's bringing you the target, and you're saying, I'm going to generate a molecule for you, and we're going to do this together, and we're going to get. So I guess that, correct me if I'm wrong, Bianca, that was kind of Morphosis' model originally. It was, we'll get a small thing, but we'll get lots of people in, and we'll do stuff like that. And they kind of switched later to the, we'll try and hold on to an asset, and that's obviously where the big value came. But they were able to partner out because everyone, so it's a balance. What you really want is, it'd be nice to have lots of people partnering with you, and then you have your own targets in-house that you kind of keep yourself. And it's that, how do you use your capital to do that? I mean, in an ideal world, you've got $300 million of cash on the balance sheet. You can do what you like, but we all know that's not true.
I guess there's also the other, the kind of compromise would be where you keep some jurisdictions and you share the cost some way. So if you look at what Galapagos has done with Gilead, that those are the deals that you have a partner, but you still can generate that value, and then you have a standing agreement or whatever. And these type of things get inside, whereas I think these are quite interesting, and I think there's a lot more of the big biotechs, if you want, or the upcoming big biotechs who want to do that rather than pharma. So I think there's a couple of options where you don't have to just hand it over or do service. There's also, we keep some, but you can help us in this way.
Yeah, it's getting the blend right.
Yeah.
Anthony, maybe your thoughts just quickly. Sorry, you mentioned we're moving away from the one drug, one target to more combo therapies and modulating pathways. Sorry, just on the clinical development, and how does a pharma company look at phase 1, phase 2, knowing that you have good target engagement, one target, combo work, thinking of that, maybe what I'm asking is there changes happening in phase 1, fail fast, fail cheap, type of mentality still, and how do you think about the combo world?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, because sometimes you think, well, I don't really want to develop two sort of independent drugs and then do the combination later. But I think the regulators are getting, you are a bit more flexible. But I think it is still challenging to work out what exactly the pathway is for that. I think when I think about sort of combination therapies in fibrosis, I'm kind of thinking about it more in from a commercial perspective. I'm not sure we're at the point yet where from day one you go, it's these two things together, and then I think about sort of fibrosis as a field. You've got the one end, the sort of metabolic modulators, the FXR agonists, those kind of things. Then you've got anti-inflammatories, and then you've got antifibrotics. And actually, where you are on the spectrum will depend on which drug you get. But realistically, if you're pretty sick, you're going to get the anti-inflammatory and an antifibrotic. And if you're the pharma company, you're probably thinking about, if I own both assets, I control the costs, the golden rule of sort of pharma maths is, if you've got a 90% gross margin product and you cut the price in half, you've got an 80% gross margin product. And if you control both products and pricing's capped, you control the costs. So that can be quite an important sort of strategic driver for big companies. It's about, so I know Astra was focused in oncology very much about trying to, they knew that oncology was going to be very much a combination place, and were trying to get as many of the assets themselves, because they knew that ultimately they would have a conversation with payers which said, we will pay for treatment of breast cancer $120,000 a year. So if there are 3 players with checkpoint inhibitors and they all want $100,000 a year, that's not going to happen. And if you're not in control, you're going to get negotiated down to a third of what you'd have got. But if you own all 3 assets, you can go, yes, we'll cap it at that, or we'll do some sort of deal. Roche has done some interesting stuff where they've said, if you can't select the patient, you pay for it if it works. And that's allowed them to control pricing. So there are a number of things that are changing, but like you said, I think it's very interesting. The regulators are going to have to move slightly if we get to a point where people actually start realising, well, we need the pill is going to have 3 new chemical entities in it from day one. I'm not sure we're there yet, to be honest.